Biography, Charlie Chaplin. April 16, 1889, December 25, 1977. Charlie Chaplin, who brought laughter to millions worldwide, the silent little tramp clown, had the type of deprived childhood that one would expect to find in a Dickens novel. Born in East Street, Walworth, London on April 16, 1889, Charles Spencer Chaplin was the son of a music hall singer and his wife. Charlie Chaplin's parents divorced early in his life, with his father providing little to no support, either financial or otherwise, leaving his mother to support them as best she could. Chaplin's mother Hannah was the brightest spot in Charlie's childhood. Formerly an actor on stage, she had lost her ability to perform, and managed to earn a subsistence living for herself, Charlie, and Charlie's older half-brother Sidney by sewing. She was an integral part of Charlie's young life, and he credited her with much of his success. Sadly, she slowly succumbed to mental illness, and by the time Charlie was 7 years old, she was confined to an asylum. Charlie and Sidney were relegated to a workhouse, a government facility for orphaned and abandoned children, not for the last time. After 2 months, she was released and the family was happily reunited, for a time. In later years, she was readmitted for an 8-month stretch later, during which time Charlie lived with his alcoholic father and stepmother, in a strained environment. Charlie Chaplin's first taste of show business. Sidney left home first, working first on a sailing ship, and later on the stage, opening the door for Charlie to follow in his footsteps later. Young Charlie felt more alone than ever without the presence of his brother, his closest friend, and confidant. However, there was a bright spot as well. In Chaplin's 9th year he toured with a stage company, the 8 Lancashire Lads, with a kind-hearted couple who led the troupe, and gave Chaplin his first taste of stage life. He also met a young Stan Laurel as part of the troupe. At the age of 12, Charlie's father died quite young. At the age of 14, Charlie's mother is readmitted to the asylum, while Sidney is out of town on an extended trip. Charlie provides for himself as best he can, desperate to avoid returning to the workhouse until Sidney returns home. With Sidney's return, young Chaplin's luck begins to turn for the better. He wins a part in the stage play Jim, a romance of Cockney to glowing reviews. Later in the same year, he earns the part of Billy in a stage adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, again to sterling reviews, and tours with the company playing that part. The tour continues through the next year, and Hannah is again released, seemingly in her right mind. All seems to be going well, until Hannah relapses, and is institutionalized for the next 7 years. Charlie is 16 years old. Charlie Chaplin tours with the Carnot troupe and enters films. Charlie continues in his acting career, as his brother Sidney joins the Carnot troupe, again opening the way there for Charlie. Charlie joins the Carnot troupe the next year, again working alongside Stan Laurel. 2 years later, Chaplin, along with the rest of the Carnot troupe, tours the United States vaudeville circuit. 2 years later, in 1912, Charlie returns with the Carnot troupe to the USA, but this time decides to stay. The next year, Chaplin leaves the stage to join Mack Sennett's Keystone Film Studio, marking a milestone both in his own life and in the history of film. Charlie Chaplin's famous tramp character is born. The pace of filmmaking in early Hollywood seems impossible by today's standards. In just 2 months, Chaplin appeared in the following Keystone films: Making a Living, Kid Auto Races, Mabel's Strange Predicament, Between Showers, a film Johnny, Tango Tangles, his favorite pastime, Cruel, Cruel Love. Although Chaplin started at the Keystone Company as a bit player, with the introduction of his world-famous tramp character he quickly exploded into a major star. By April, at the age of 25, Chaplin directs his first film, 20 Minutes of Love. By November of that year, Chaplin is leaving Keystone, having signed an exclusive contract for the newly formed S&A Film Company. Sidney follows in Charlie's steps this time and joins the Keystone Company shortly before Charlie left it. In February of 1915, Chaplin begins work for S&A, with greater control over his films than ever before, but not enough to avoid creative differences with his bosses at S&A. However, another milestone occurs at the same time. He meets Edna Purviance, who was to be his leading lady for many of his films, as well as an off-again, on-again romance. At S&A, Chaplin created many of the classic short films he's best remembered for, including his new job, A Jitney Elopement, The Tramp, A Night in the Show, and The Immigrant. In February of 1916, Chaplin again jumps to another film company, Mutual, where he continues to create some of his finest shorts, including The Floorwalker, The Vagabond, The Pawnshop, Behind the Screen, and The Rink. In both his personal and professional life, his inner circle began to expand. He first hired Henry Bergman, the heavy villain in so many of Chaplin's films, as well as hiring Tom Harrington as his personal secretary, a position which he kept for many decades, becoming Chaplin's right-hand man in many respects. Desiring even more creative control, Chaplin began building his own studio in the fall of 1917 and signed with yet another studio, First National. For the first time, Chaplin has complete control over every step of his films. For First National, Chaplin continues to create classic shorts, A Dog's Life, Shoulder Arms, and The Bond. In 1918, he also marries for the first, but not the last, time to Mildred Harris. Charlie Chaplin's Woman Troubles Charlie begins in his personal life with a recurring, destructive pattern. He chases, and frequently marries, a young woman, loses interest in her, being consumed by his creative energies, goes through a messy breakup, or divorce, typically impacting his professional life, and then repeats the pattern. In November of that year, his first true love, Hetty Kelly, dies, although Chaplin doesn't find this out until he visits England in 1921. Charlie Chaplin Pathos and Comedy. 1919 was a year of both great gains and losses for Charlie. One of his most popular short films, Sunny Side, is released, demonstrating a degree of both pathos and comedy mixed together to a high degree. Chaplin had been slowly moving the Little Tramp towards this more balanced characterization for some time, and now Charlie the Tramp is maturing. Sadly, Charlie the human being suffered a terrible loss, as his and Mildred's infant child is born, horribly deformed, and dies after only 3 days. Charlie sought solace in his work, alienating his wife even more. In that same year, he formed United Artists with his closest friend Douglas Fairbanks and Fairbanks' wife, screen legend Mary Pickford, in a successful effort to keep the major studios from monopolizing and controlling all aspects of production. In December of that year, A Day's Pleasure was released, dealing with a happy family trying to enjoy a quiet day at the beach, somewhat ironically, considering the state of Charlie Chaplin's personal life at that stage. But something new was on the horizon. Charlie Chaplin had begun production of The Kid. Charlie Chaplin The Kid was Charlie Chaplin's first full-length movie. It, more than anything else to that date, made Chaplin a living legend. It took over a year to produce, and was an incredible success for Chaplin, both financially and artistically. Over the next year, Charlie Chaplin continues working on The Kid, as his perfectionism takes more and more time in creating his film masterpieces. Sadly, he and Mildred Harris divorced at this time, in one of the most bitter Hollywood divorces seen up to this point. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, as The Kid is finally released to unanimous praise and record box office success in 1921. Charlie Chaplin had gone through a very difficult time and needed time to relax and renew himself.